Wow, it's good to be back. I would be remiss if among my first words to you weren't the words, thank you. Thank you for your prayers, your cards, your texts, even when Wynn told you not to. Thank you. That veil is lifted now, by the way. Thank you for your Facebook messages, for all the meals. Thank you for your love and support over the last month. Many thanks to Father Wynn and to Kathy, who sat with me at the hospital. Many thanks to Mother Sue and the rest of the staff for their support and love as I have recovered. I stopped in the office in mid-January and ran into a parishioner who said, "I'm so glad to see you. We've been praying for you so hard that I'm tired." Well, I want you to know I could feel those prayers and your support and your love, and I thank you for it. I will say more about the Stokes and my prognosis at announcement time, but know that I am very thankful for this community and for your love during my recovery. I've been following the lectionary with you while I was out. I must reiterate that I am so glad we are now in Mark and have left Matthew. Matthew is the perfect gospel for you if you have ADD. He machine guns right through the life of Jesus, beginning with the baptism and ending with an empty tomb. And it's as if he is saying, this is the bare minimum you need to know to make up your mind about who Jesus is, and here it is. He is so brief, in fact, that the lectionary had to supplement a gospel lesson with one from John a few weeks ago. And today we get to read about Jesus' first healing miracle in the gospel. And I love this first scene in Mark. Jesus is the guest speaker at the synagogue that morning. He's a young whippersnapper who doesn't quote ancient rabbis, but rather innovates upon the scriptures based on his own interpretations. And people are skeptical. Not only are people skeptical of him, his hosts don't even do a good job protecting the pulpit, and a possessed man interrupts the proceedings. Have you ever been in a church where that happened? I have, and it was in this one. A few years ago, we were hosting a diocesan service of racial reconciliation. The whole diocese was invited. We had many distinguished guests, not least of which was our preacher for that day, the Reverend Stephanie Spellers, presiding Bishop Curry's canon for evangelism and reconciliation. Now, I bet you didn't even know we had a canon for evangelism, but there it is. The Reverend Spellers is a spellbinding preacher, and we were all hanging on her every word when she paused in the sermon, and the room got quiet, and she did what many of us preachers do. She asked a rhetorical question. Her question was along the lines of, when in your past have you witnessed or experienced racism? It's a heavy question, and the room took its time digesting it. And then a man from the back of the church starts screaming out his answer and begins charging up the aisle toward Reverend Spellers as if to begin a private conversation with her in the pulpit. I was in charge of logistics that day, and I can tell you I didn't see that one coming. I didn't know what to do. The ushers, I don't think, knew what to do. We all just sat there with our mouths open, shocked at what was unfolding before us. But never losing her cool or command of the room, she engaged the guy who at that time was standing right over here. And she said, "I understand your pain, and I want to hear your story after the service." That was all it took. He was satisfied with that and sat back down. If I had been closer to him, I would have told him to be quiet or to leave. If not, have grabbed his arm and stopped his advance on the pulpit. But being dumbfounded, I got to witness that day the gospel in action. As Reverend Spellers listened to what he had to say, answered him, and communicated to him that he does matter to this congregation. If any of you jump up and start answering my rhetorical questions in a sermon, I will now know how to deal with it. And what the Reverend Spellers did is exactly what Jesus did. In his first public speaking engagement, a man that was seen as an interruption was heard, was loved, and was healed. Jesus listened to someone who everyone else wanted to be quiet and healed him. What Jesus does in that first healing miracle in Mark, he continues throughout his ministry and the ministry of the church. I noticed something else while I was reading this gospel lesson over the last month. In fact, I started reading it while I was in the ICU at Centera. I was worried that the Stokes had impaired my ability to do what I love, and I wanted to get started on my next sermon to assure myself that that wasn't the case. As soon as Wynn and I worked out a date when I would return, I started reading through the Gospel of Mark. Now, you need to understand the lens through which I was seeing everything at that point. I was mad at my body for doing something it shouldn't do for another 40 years at least, if ever. Frustrated at the doctors for not being able to tell me what happened or if it would happen again. I was wanting answers, and no one was providing any. In fact, I was told there was a good chance I may never know why the strokes happened. Well, I wanted to then jump up and scream and demand someone give me the story, or hear my story, and give me the answers. It didn't happen. So back to reading Mark I went. As I was reading, I began to notice something about the characters in the story. I think when we read the gospel, we all look for our place in it. And you know what I noticed as I was trying to find mine? The only characters in the Gospel of Mark who are sure, who know beyond the shadow of a doubt what's going on, those characters are always demons. Have you noticed that? I don't think any of us want to be in their place in the story. I didn't. Jesus hardly arrives on the scene when the demons notice him and they start screaming out, "We know you're the Holy One of God. Have you come to destroy us?" Every time this unsolicited, absolute confession is made, it comes from a place of certainty espoused by fear. If you have the power to destroy us, we do need to know who you are and where you are. Do you know what everyone else in the gospel is doing? Thank you for not answering that rhetorical question. They're asking questions, even the disciples, most especially the disciples. And the questions begin there in Capernaum. What is this? Who is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And the questions continue throughout Mark's gospel. Who is this that forgives sins? Who is this that eats with publicans and sinners? Who is this that even the winds and waves obey his will? As I was sitting there wanting certainty and reading, I realized that we do this to God a lot. We want to know the creedal formula for who God is. We want to know a list of beliefs, some immutable truths about God, which we can spout off and say we believe. I do this anyway. I did it in my discernment process for the priesthood. I remember my prayers then went somewhat like this. God, tell me what you want me to do, list it out for me, and then leave me alone while I do it. Do you realize we don't treat any of our other intimate relationships that way? You don't propose to your significant other and say, tell me what I need to believe about you so that I can go about my life until I forget. And then we'll make another date and I'll ask you this question again. No, we spend time with the significant others in our lives. We get to know them organically, not academically. I wonder if questions aren't a better barometer of our relationship with God than answers. I wonder if never being quite sure about the breadth and depth of God is where we are called to live. I wonder if being in a constant state of wonder and maybe even bewilderment is perhaps where God calls us. I wonder if we'll question, as those in the Gospel of Mark, who is this speaking with so much authority? Who is this who forgives sins? Who is this that even the winds and waves obey his will? Who is this Jesus of Nazareth?